psychological study from the National Institute of Mental Health.
Just this morning, along with his longtime
circle
psychiatrist.
of depression is growing wider, broader.
15% of women suffer from this disorder.
Affecting over 20 million Americans. Changes that have occurred in the brain.
Abnormalities in the neurotransmitters.
Is that a chemical imbalance?
Patient's got a problem, they've got a drug.
6 million American kids take prescribed medication.
Psychiatric care.
But what if the criminal is mentally ill? The punishment, a form of aversion therapy.
10 minute cures on the show, but I want to...
Seasonal affective disorder.
OCD.
Oppositional defiant disorder.
Schools criticized for over-prescribing.
Everywhere you look, there it is. Think psychiatry has nothing to do with you? Think again. The whole field of psychiatry has gotten into every facet of your life.
They basically believe that everyone is mentally ill.
You smoke too much, it's a disease. You're too unhappy, it's a disease. You're too thin, it's a disease. You're too fat, it's a disease.
Where are these coming from? These are coming from the minds of psychiatrists that are dreaming these things up, writing papers and getting published with their names on it, creating these new diseases.
First he said that I had ADD. Then he said that I was depressed. Then he said I might be bipolar, but I don't have ADD anymore.
And he said, you know, I've been noticing you, and I wonder if you have it too.
What they decided is that both my husband and my son had a chemical imbalance that needed to be corrected with a chemical balancer.
There is not one shred of credible evidence that any respectable scientist would consider valid, demonstrating that anything that psychiatrists call mental illness are brain diseases or biochemical imbalances. It's all fraud.
There's no reliability of diagnosis, and there is no science. It's just pseudoscience. It's pretend science.
This is one of the most open secrets in all of America in the psychiatric field, that nothing is being done that's legitimate, and they're billing for it.
Psychiatrists claim that over 1 billion of the world's population is mentally ill. In the past 30 years, they have prescribed psychiatric medications to 543 million people. And right now, they drug 17 million school children with stimulants and antidepressants. When recently asked about the scientific basis of their profession, those psychiatrists willing to be interviewed offered nothing but excuses.
Psychiatric illness is not really illness.
How do you evaluate if someone is cured or sick?
Cure is certainly something we look forward to. We had no earthly idea how to accomplish.
We're not good at causes. We don't know what causes mental illness.
But that hasn't stopped them from pronouncing themselves mental health experts and treating people against their will. And the results?
This psychiatrist, man who's supposed to work to heal people, has done nothing but destroy this man's life, and in destroying his life, destroying the lives of all of his loved ones. Excuse me.
They've damaged and ruined my son, and they've trapped him in a system.
The way that they treated him and made him feel like he was worthless.
Bryant was being kept dumb and high on Ritalin so that they could make $2,500 per month.
He gave me Valium, and I got addicted to it.
It wiped out my life.
My life has been ruined. My joy has been stolen.
She was laying there. She took two gasps of air and died right there in front of me.
It is really tragic. It's awful. And it's being done for money. That's why it's being done.
Oh, it's got to be in the billions. I don't know the exact number, but it's got to be in the billions. It's just unbelievable.
This is so big that it boggles the mind.
Take the human tragedy you have just seen and multiply it by the millions. In the past 4 decades, nearly twice as many Americans have died in government psychiatric hospitals than in all U.S. wars since 1776. Insurance companies pay out $69 billion every year for psychiatric services, doubling the cost of medical insurance premiums. And while raking in over $2 trillion annually, psychiatrists cannot point to a single cure. Hard to believe? That's exactly what they count on. And as we will show you, it's how they have been getting away with it from the very beginning.
The roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who are uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London was one of the world's first psychiatric institutions. Commonly referred to as Bedlam, the hospital was little more than a warehouse for those deemed mad. Inmates were confined to cages, closets, and animal stalls, chained to walls, and flogged, while the asylum charged admission for public viewings. In the 18th century, William Batty was the first to promote that his institutions could cure the mentally ill. Batty's madhouses made him one of the richest men in England, though his treatments were every bit as inhumane as those practiced in Bedlam, with not a single patient cured. His financial success triggered a boom in the asylum business and an opportunity for psychiatrists to cash in on this new growth industry.
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector, of asylumdom, as some historians have called it, is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
But while those who ran the institutions were getting rich, psychiatrists yet lacked the credibility to maximize their cash flow.
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid, and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
Psychiatrists next sought to give credence to their practices by cloaking them in the language of medicine. This repackaging of treatment became known as the medical model.
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. But as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
Pushing the biological theory of mental illness a step further, an American, Benjamin Rush, put forth the idea that insanity was caused by too much blood in the head. The cure? Remove the blood by any means possible. Restraint, cold water, bleeding, even terror. And with that, a new medical model was created.
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness. He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time, and Rush announces in a letter that he's invented this new contraption and dubbed it the tranquilizer.
Rush's often lethal procedures were detailed in his 1812 textbook, which remained psychiatry's authoritative source for the next 70 years. He was so revered that in 1965, Rush was enshrined as the father of American psychiatry on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association. As the 1800s wore on, psychiatry's mounting failures at curing madness threatened their financial bottom line, forcing them to invent new medical models.
The cures promised when it was delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size, but not growing in their effectiveness.
The 20th century brought more medical models. American psychiatrist Henry Cotton mutilated his patients by removing their body parts, declaring this a breakthrough in the treatment of mental illness.
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses, but when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
As public outcry escalated over torture and maiming of patients, psychiatrists would invent new methods, each one hailed as the miracle cure. But each one was ultimately proven no more effective nor less brutal than the last.
This is a history of psychiatry, more or less, to damage the patient. I mean, this is a version of the original model, which was to chain them like animals.
If you're doing it to somebody because you insist that they have to change, and you're going to do that by turning the screws, you might say, whether it's with medication, restraint, whatever, that's torture. And a huge part of what psychiatry has done really comes down to torture.
As the 20th century progressed, psychiatry would continue to seek legitimacy by transforming itself into a medical discipline. But they succeeded only in creating more efficient ways of inflicting mental and physical torture and death, a legacy that has carried forward into modern psychiatry, with its most profitable medical model to date, the mass drugging of millions. But to do this, psychiatrists first had to shatter one of mankind's most cherished beliefs, decreeing that people were not what they thought they were. Leipzig University, Germany, 1879. Professor Wilhelm Wundt experiments on the human senses. Wundt declares man's thoughts, personality, and behavior are nothing more than chemical reactions in the brain.
Wundt became frustrated with his inability to change behavior because he was dealing with the original, psychology. That's the psyche, that's the soul. He created a new science, which was based on man being an animal without a soul, to be trained. Not to be a thinker, but to be trained.
Students from around the world gathered to study Wundt's new definition of man as a soulless organism. The spirit of the age was summed up by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Gott ist tot. Gott bleibt tot. Wir haben ihn umgebracht.
Following Wundt's theory, a Russian, Ivan Pavlov, conducted animal experiments seeking methods to modify behavior.
Pavlov studied in Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, in the late 1800s. And he experimented with dogs, with electrodes and stimulus response denying privileges to denying rewards.
And he noticed that when you brought out some food in front of animals, dogs in particular, that they would begin to salivate. So he'd ring the bell at the same time that he brought the food out, and then eventually, instead of bringing the food out, he just rang the bell, and of course the dogs got all excited. He called that a conditioned reflex.
Pavlov's first human subjects were children. He punched holes in their cheeks to collect and measure their saliva.
Pavlovian conditioning became one of the major foundations of a lot of behavioral science research in the 20th century.
The idea that behavior could be controlled through repetitive conditioning became known as behaviorism.
The behaviorists believed that all children are animals and can be trained as animals. This was the view of behaviorists. As a matter of fact, John Watson, the most famous of the behaviorists, says that you have to treat human beings or look at human beings the way you would look at the ox you slaughter. See, the behavior is not interested in what's up in your head or your soul because they don't believe there is a soul.
Watson's successor, Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner, believed all behavior could be manipulated to suit whatever ends the behavioral psychologist was seeking.
Skinner developed what's called operant conditioning, where he was able to demonstrate you can change animal behavior by certain schedules of reinforcement, by giving them rewards at certain times, and then you can teach pigeons to play ping pong, for example, and you can teach rats to run mazes, and you can teach human beings to seek certain economic or societal rewards.
Skinner could actually shape new behavior patterns, and this actually was the sort of thing he quite soon became very famous for.
Perhaps his most notorious experiment was the Skinner box.
He was designing the Skinner box, which is something like a big playpen, but everything in it's controlled. The temperature's controlled, the light's controlled, and so on. And the idea is then you present children with certain stimuli that you want them to learn to react to.
For nearly a year, Skinner isolated his daughter in a box similar to those he built for rats.
The child was stimulated and had to respond in a certain way, like a chicken or a rat in a cage, because they firmly believe that children are animals. If you believe, though, that a child is a human being, you can't train him like a rat.
Today, about $40 million a year in taxpayer money is paid out by the United States National Institute of Mental Health for behavioral psychology research. A total of $19 billion since 1948. With these funds, psychiatrists apply the same conditioning techniques developed by Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Case in point, a juvenile detention center where children are hooked up to 270-volt batteries and shocked in a procedure called aversion therapy.
Antoine was having a number of problems because he was up at a center that was shocking him every time he did anything. There was a button on a little, almost like a TV remote, that would be used and pushed.
They will get an additional shock for trying to remove the electrode. So they're expected to sit there and let this electricity pass through their skin without trying to remove it. If they yell in anticipation of the shock, they will shock the student an additional time for yell.
The cost to send a student to Judge Rottenberg from New York is about $214,000 per student. These students are tortured. They're given this electric shock therapy for no other reason but to inflict pain.
Other techniques include administering electric shock to treat sexual deviance, sending powerful magnetic impulses through the skull to interrupt brain activity, and shooting high voltage through surgically implanted electrodes, all to stifle problem behavior, and costing up to $100,000 per patient. And while this science without a soul led to behavior modification techniques that continue to generate billions in research and treatment, it also laid the groundwork for another psychiatric movement that would cause the deaths of millions.
January 1945. As World War II comes to a close, the full horror of Hitler's final solution is exposed, with grotesque killing factories unparalleled in human history. Mass graves filled with corpses of men, women, and children, murdered by starvation, bullets, and poison gas. What could drive men to commit such atrocities against their fellow human beings?
The answer is the pseudo-science called eugenics, created and promoted by psychiatrists decades before the Nazis came to power.
The eugenics movement got started in 1883 with Francis Galton, and he felt that human beings should take evolution in their own hands, and that the most talented individuals, the most healthy individuals, the most attractive individuals should have more offspring.
There was great concern that people that they considered had poor genes were reproducing faster than the people they considered had good genes.
They felt that a medical solution might be the proper one. This is what led to the sterilization movement.
It resulted in sterilization of mentally ill people, sterilization of retarded people, sterilization of people we don't like politically and sociologically. So the problem is not with genetics. The problem is a pretend phony genetics used to justify inhumane social policies.
Though never proven as anything but theory, by the early part of the 20th century, eugenics had spread to almost 30 countries, from England to Brazil, Mexico, Sweden, Russia, and most notably, the United States, where forced sterilization was widely practiced.
Eugenics movement in Germany was somewhat different than the eugenics movement in the United States in that there were many more physicians and psychiatrists. Alfred Ploetz was one of the pioneers in the German eugenics movement and how to control the population of those whom he considered inferior. In 1905, along with his brother-in-law, Ernst Rudin, he established the first organization for racial hygiene.
Alle Nationen haben sich mit einer außergewöhnlich großen Menge an minderwertigen, schwachen, kranken und Verkrüppelten abzugeben. Durch kluge Gesetze über Sterilisation würden wir auch in der Lage sein, den vernünftigsten Weg der Zeugung herbeizuführen.
Hitler was particularly impressed by American eugenicist Madison Grant. Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, was proclaimed by Hitler as his personal Bible. In his book, Mein Kampf, Hitler further hailed eugenics as the science that would rebuild the German nation.
Körperlich oder geistig gesund ist, dem ist es nicht erlaubt, seine Krankheit an seine Kinder weiterzugeben. Das Recht auf persönliche Freiheit wird durch seine Pflicht, die Rasse zu beschützen, eingeschränkt.
The German eugenicists welcomed the Nazi advent to power because the Nazi program could fund the very programs that they had in mind. The Nazis gave them political support, financial support, and conversely, the psychiatrists gave the Nazis a medical justification for their genocidal policies.
Something like 40% of German psychiatrists had joined the SS by 1933. They weren't forced into the SS, they just joined it naturally, because the beliefs were very, very similar.
Rudin and his work led directly to the decision to move from sterilization to murder.
Their plan was simple. First, convince the public that feeble-minded undesirables wanted to escape the burden of their existence, but could not say it, and that killing them was an act of mercy. Then extend the definition of inferior to include Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, all unworthy of life. Psychiatrists produced propaganda movies known as the Nazi killing films, shown in all 5,300 theaters throughout Germany.
Geisteskrankheit ist als ein Erbübel eine der größten Gefahren für die Volksgesundheit. Irrtum ist, dass sich solche Kranken glücklich fühlen und am Leben hängen. Sie haben überhaupt kein Daseinsbewusstsein. Wer von ihr befallen wird, dem ist die schwerste Last des Schicksals auferlegt. Ein Dasein ohne Leben.
It first started with passive violence, which is starvation,
It then intensified to lethal injections, and finally it developed into systematic gassing and cremation.
Their headquarters were established in Berlin under the infamous code name T4.
T4 program was named after Tiergarten 4, which essentially resulted over a period of time in the murder of about 70,000 people who were deemed mentally retarded, emotionally distraught, or physically handicapped by the Germans. They were called life unworthy of living.
The killing, piloted in psychiatric institutions across Germany, then moved into the concentration camps, with top German psychiatrists as the executioners. Paul Nietzsche, the T4 director, declared,
Das Aussortieren in den Konzentrationslagern lief etwa genauso ab wie in den Nervenheilanstalten. Und mit selbigen Erfassungsbögen.
6 million Jews died in concentration camps and as a result of Nazi extermination policies. Rudin congratulated Hitler for making his, that is Rudin's, 30-year dream come true.
After the Nazi surrender, an international court of justice was held to put psychiatry on trial for its war crimes. But American psychiatrists, fearing a permanent blow to the future of psychiatry, stepped in by shifting the blame onto a handful of German psychiatrists.
There were some doctors who were prosecuted, but very few. Ernst Rudin returned to Switzerland at the end of the war. He did not serve any prison time.
One of the strangest things of all about the legacy of Nazi science is that some of the nastiest psychiatric eugenicists at the end of the war went back to work either in Germany or sometimes in the United States.
What began with a psychiatric plan to eliminate undesirable humanity had now spread throughout the civilized world and was responsible for the murder of 11 million people.